Hi, listeners, and welcome to the I Am Global podcast series, the podcast of International Management Division of the Academy of Management. I am Luis Ricardo, and together with the members of the Membership Drive Committee, we are going to talk to scholars from the I Am division to know more about them, their research, and motivations. And I should add, this podcast is one among many initiatives of the IM division to foster research and practice of management with cross-border and cross-cultural dimension. Visit us at im.aom.org to get started. Now on to the show.
Welcome to the 7th episode of the Global Podcast of the International Management Division of the Academy of Management. I'm Alfred Presbitero, Assistant Professor at Deakin Business School, Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and I'll be your host for this episode. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Ilan Alon, a well-respected and highly esteemed academic, and he will be sharing with us his expertise on the globalization of Chinese enterprises. Professor Alon is a professor of strategy and international marketing at the School of Business and Law at the University of Agder in Norway. He holds a PhD from Kent State University in the US. Professor Alon is an expert in the field of international business, specializing on internationalization, modes of entry, political risk, cultural intelligence, and emerging markets. He has done research on China for more than 20 years now. He has widely published in top international business, international management, and marketing journals, and he's also serving as the editor-in-chief of two journals, the International Journal of Emerging Markets and the European Journal of International Management. Professor Alon has held research positions at various institutions such as Harvard University, Georgetown University, both in the US, Copenhagen Business School in Denmark, to name a few. He has also worked with government bodies, non-for-profit organizations, multinational companies, and international associations on various projects, ranging from capacity development at the macro level to international business development at the firm and project level. So let's all welcome Professor Ilan Alon.
Thank you. Thank you for such a nice presentation.
All right. So today we'll be talking about the globalization of Chinese enterprises. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, Ilan, what is your motivation in studying Chinese enterprises? Could you share with us the influences? Why are you interested in this topic? Why did you spend 20 years of your life and still continuing researching on globalization of Chinese enterprises?
Well, the answer is serendipity. Like many things in life, I was invited to teach in China in 1998 and went there for the first time in my life and was so surprised. You know, my expectation of China was that of developing country with dilapidated infrastructure, with people wearing Maoist suits and conforming to government agenda. And when I came there in the late 1990s, I just saw an extremely dynamic country with extreme amount of energy, with streets full of shopping and a level of development that changed from year to year. That since the late 1990s, when I went there every year, I just saw these remarkable changes in infrastructure and in people's culture and in the overall economy. And later on, when I started the China Goes Global Association, I also saw the globalization of Chinese enterprises. And it is this fascination in all these changes that I saw that I just prompted me to want to learn more, first about the language and the culture, and then about the business practices, and finally, to engage in research and to try to write something to teach others about what I have observed and what I've seen.
Yep. So you have widely published in the area of globalization of Chinese enterprises. So what have you known so far in relation to China's outward foreign direct investment flows and position?
Well, the Chinese globalization of foreign direct investment, and it's really started with exports. As you know, most of our products in Australia, in America, and Europe are imported from China. So we're all familiar with the export modalities. But more recently, I would say about a decade ago, we started to see Chinese companies aggressively buying foreign companies in Australia, in Europe, in Africa, in America. So this uh, is fascinating because unlike the Western companies from which we have all the great theories, the Chinese companies are motivated by different kind of factors. As latecomers, they have some disadvantages, but they also have some advantages. They could leapfrog, for example, and they can get into industries that are fledgling. They can consolidate older industries, and since they're already part of the value-added chain, it was relatively easy for them to kind of integrate, right? To move downstream and upstream, right? Upstream towards the technology, and downstream toward the consumers. And again, unlike the Western firms, the motivations were different. So it kind of called for maybe a different approach, perhaps a modification of the existing theories, or perhaps a creation of entirely new theories to explain why and how Chinese firms go global.
Yep. I remember Ravi Ramamurthy saying that China has a unique way of internationalization, and it's abrupt. There's too much equity. Is that still happening right now?
Yeah, indeed, Ravi Ramamarty is, I think, one of the foundational researchers on emerging market multinationals, and his work on China suggests that China didn't go out of a position of strength, which is what we teach in business schools, that you should have a competitive advantage and a proprietary technology, and if you see market imperfections in other countries, you can go in there and you can take advantage of these great brands and technologies that you have overseas, so essentially exploiting them to make money. What the Chinese companies and other emerging markets companies' problems was it didn't have a competitive advantage, actually, in at least not in technology or intellectual property. So they came out of position of weakness, and as a result, they needed to buy their strengths. And the internationalization, in a sense, was as a result of weakness rather than a result of strength. So Geely, for example, bought Volvo not because Geely makes amazing cars; it's because Geely doesn't have great safety cars, doesn't have a lot of the technologies that Volvo have, and doesn't have the footprint of Volvo in Europe. So by buying Volvo, it has acquired all these capabilities, which is in a way a very different way of looking at global expansion from the stuff that we teach in the textbook in the West.
Yep. So, can we say that the primary motivation for China is really to explore business potential overseas? Can we say that?
Well, it's hard. It's actually more complicated than that, because you assume oftentimes we assume that in business that the main decision makers are the business leaders. Well, in China, the main decision makers are the government leaders, in particular the Chinese Communist Party, and they essentially create the roadmap for Chinese multinationals, and then enable these Chinese multinationals through policy, internal policy, through financing, and through external geopolitical relationships, including, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. So we actually wrote a book on the Belt and Road Initiative that showed kind of the impact of this initiative in different countries. But certainly that has happened, that has opened the door for many multinational companies to enter countries that perhaps were very risky, like the ones in Africa, or perhaps near neighbors. But in any case, allowing them to leverage the government-to-government relationships that China has developed over the years.
Yep. And how about the transactional cost? I just remember Marshall Mayer saying that the transactional cost is higher if it's from province to province in China as compared to a province to, let's say, overseas. Is that still true up until today?
To a lesser extent than it used to be. There's a phenomena called round tripping, in which we can, many companies, Chinese companies, set up overseas affiliations, or a lot of times in tax shelters overseas, and then brought that money back as foreign direct investment, benefiting from the incentives to do so. And some of it actually facilitated the province to province type of trade. So it seemed kind of backwards. You have to go overseas in order to go back. But there was some, let's say, regulatory windows of opportunity that they could take advantage of. And in a way, this regulatory arbitrage to some extent is starting to close. Also, the protectionism within China among provinces is also starting to disappear because of the very strong central government. Nevertheless, it still exists that you would see different types, different brands of cars in Beijing than Shanghai. And we have to remember that each one of these provinces is by itself bigger than most countries, right? And in fact, even in China, some of the top cities are bigger than most countries, right? I mean, Shanghai has 20 million people now or something like that, right? That's more than many countries, right? That's a lot of people. How many people live in Australia?
24 million.
Exactly. So imagine for a second that a single city in China has more people than all of Australia. So it's true that perhaps, to make an impact, our unit of analysis might be the province or the city rather than the country. And in fact, many researchers on China recently looking more and more at provincial differences and how they impact both the inbound and outbound economic activities and business activities.
Yep. So going back to what you mentioned about the political maturity that China has achieved right now, how about the institutional maturity for businesses? I just remember what John Child is saying in his theory that it's important to have both political and institutional maturity for businesses. So could you comment on the institutional maturity of businesses in China right now?
I think you're referring to the article by Marinova and Child in Management Organization Review.
Yep.
And in this article, actually, I think it comes from Marinova's dissertation, I'm not sure. But in this article, they claim not that you have to have institutional maturity, but that the world can divide into 4 quadrants, which include high and low institutional maturity and high and low political stability. But I think the innovation of their paper in particular was not that this 2 by 2, but the point that they made is that the home host country bilateral relations are affected by which quadrant you come from and which quadrant you go to. And China, in their model, was classified as a country that is young on institutional maturity and perhaps politically stable. And in their model, the United States of America was institutionally mature and politically stable. Now, we know from just recent news these days that the United States is perhaps less politically stable as we have expected. So in fact, it's a very good model. And what it allows us to do is to really think that these relationships, international business relationships, are oftentimes dyadic, right? So the kind of theories that we have that try to generalize across these dyadic relations might have the wrong assumptions and therefore the wrong explanations and predictions.
Yep.
So I do agree with their assessment that, and I think that's the big contribution that they made, is that the dyadic bilateral relations are important. In a recent study that we just published in the Journal of International Business Policy, we actually showed that these dyadic relations can be modeled to some extent by the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So those countries that are, and we've seen that, by the way, in other ways, like UN voting and other kind of relations, that when those, China has a kind of a particularized relations with a set of countries that are the good countries, the ones they want to do business with, the one they want to support, and those countries that perhaps are not as attractive to the Chinese. For example, the United States, right? So even to get technologies now, the Chinese are much more focused on European countries and try to, at least to some extent, avoid direct confrontation with the United States.
Now, let's talk about the global pandemic. We know that the global pandemic has impacted everyone. So where do you see China to be leading or to be going after this global pandemic, when this global pandemic is
I think this
over?
is a fascinating question that still remains, I think. In fact, as I was sitting at home in isolation, trying to understand what's happening, I wrote a few papers, very short papers that were published on the impact of COVID-19 on international business. And I really do believe that international business as we know it has changed forever. So our job has changed because, we used to think that globalization is an ever-growing process that ultimately will lead to a single world market dominated by the multinational companies producing products for consumer with similar insatiable needs. So, in fact, what we saw from this global pandemic is globalization is fragile. And if we look at globalization as the movement of people, products, ideas, and money, we could see that the movement of people has been curtailed to almost nothing. I mean, we started this right before the interview started. We talked about our own respective countries, Norway, Australia, how they closed the airports. I mean, how we used to go to conferences and move about and meet people and give lectures in different countries. And now we are zooming around the world using technology. So we've seen a kind of a change in the structure of globalization. So we could see technology has really substituted many of the physical travels that we used to have probably forever to some extent, at least some of it. And we see that travel and tourism has been decimated. So the latest statistics, if I showed you the graph of international tourists, international travel, it's went back 30, 40 years in terms of level of expansion. And then technology went up, money. We have a new kind of money, digital money, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin that can travel the world with, very little oversight. We have governments attempting to control the situation and, in the process, also control people, monitor people, instruct people, essentially put us all in jail by putting us in, making us work from home and not leave our locations in our countries. So we have ideas that are continuing to flow between countries. And we have products that have also slowed down because of supply chain problems and because demand has been hampered by closed shopping malls. So in a sense, what we have a kind of a structural break, as we call it in economics, in the progression of globalization. And this structural change essentially has turned our discipline, international business, upside down. And I think if we're not ready to change with it, we're going to become obsolete. I do remember the early 90s and some of the professors that touted about, wow, look at that, we have globalization. Well, now, and for a while they were very relevant and then they lost their relevance. But now, those who keep touting the stuff of the past without thinking about how the world has changed structurally, I think will become irrelevant very quickly.
Yep.
And now, what does it mean for our theories? It means that we really need to rethink our theories, right? And to test our assumptions to see have we made the right assumptions, right? And how does that affect the predictions that we make, the relationships between the variables that we analyze? Now, with respect to China, China was in the background to some extent. The workshop of the world, 70% of the white goods and the electronics and the toys and the clothes of the entire world were made in China. And it was okay with everybody because China was buying US treasuries to a large extent, financing the American trade deficit, and giving the Americans both cheap products and cheap capital to expand their real estate, to expand their wealth. And all of a sudden, the pandemic comes, unfortunately for China, under the Trump administration, who points the finger at China directly and say, it's your fault. Putting America and China, the two largest economies in the world, the two largest military powers in the world, in direct conflict with one another. Again, changing the structures of globalization to perhaps to some extent to what we used to have under the Soviet Union, that is a kind of a new Cold War, a Cold War pinned by this health crisis now. But I think it will continue with, I think we're in a very, very verge of a big conflict with US and China in the South China Sea, perhaps over Taiwan. And we already see now clusters of economic activity that will emerge out of it. Are you with us or against this type of mentality of the United States? Are you in the China camp or are you in the American camp? And countries have to choose. Australia has to choose. And I think Australia has made the choice, right? And paying the consequences for it. So how do we model this stuff in, I don't know, the different kind of theories that we have where the firm is in the center of activities, right? Where the manager is the major decision maker, when in fact, kind of the geopolitics, in particular with China vis-a-vis the rest of the world, are dominating the resulting structures.
So given all these disruptions and uncertainties, what do you think are some of the capabilities that we need to develop in our firms, or at least, or in our amongst our managers and our global leaders?
Yeah, I think that the business discipline has been too myopic. And, we in international business have always taken pride in the fact that we are not disciplinary, that we're multidisciplinary, but when you start looking at it, are we really multidisciplinary? What I see is that Jibs has emerged as the best journal, and I see us starting to quote each other and becoming incestuous as every other discipline. Now we've created enough good scholars and good scholarship that we can be incestuous. So to some extent, it testifies to our success as a discipline, that we have been able to kind of develop an ecosystem of articles that can quote each other and thrive on that. In fact, some of the articles he asked me about, right? We can create this, and we teach that to our students. But I think our students need to learn about politics and about sociology and about geography and about history. And I really think they're missing it. You teach, you research cultural intelligence, and one of the things that we've done in the cultural intelligence models that we've developed, we've asked people to answer basic knowledge questions. And they don't know it. They fail miserably. So to some extent, we have been teaching them, be open-minded, be flexible, be aware, but we haven't forgot about the knowledge component, right? Forgot about the history component, forgot about geography component. In fact, I was interviewed by a newspaper and they said, well, what did you find confusing and how does that relate to the way we teach things? Well, we teach a lot of sensitivity, cultural sensitivity, these kind of courses, but we forget to teach them geography or history, right? You want to understand the country, you have to understand its history. China is a case in point. If you want to understand why the Chinese sovereignty is so important to them, why Taiwan is so important to them, why Hong Kong is so important to them, just learn their history. Just see what the colonial powers of the time have done to bring us to the point where we are today. Philippines, you're from the Philippines, you know this. From your own personal, on your skin, on your family skins, on your ancestry skins, you know what happened there with the Americans, with the Spanish, with the different people, right? So I think to some extent, what the beauty of international business is that we really can create programs that allow us to see the world from multiple lenses and allows us to therefore have a more panoramic overview, unlike, let's say, finance and marketing, where they're so self-contained in their own literature and their own way of thinking that they kind of forget the bigger world. We in international business have the advantage. But yet, I think we are not moving in that direction. So we need to think about how do we bring all these different external disciplines into our field. In my PhD, by the way, I took political science. So, in my university in Kent State in Ohio, one of the things that we could do is we could study like a minor, like another subject matter outside the business school at the PhD level as a way to complement our education. So those people interested in, psychology could do psychology or sociology or politics. I took political science and international relations. And I must say that really informed my IB research because I'm able to talk about geopolitical risks. I'm able to talk about country to country relations and, realism and neorealism points of view, in a way that really allows our discipline to develop. And that's the beauty. That's why I was so attracted to international business as a discipline.
And for those new in the field of Chinese enterprises, you've mentioned about understanding the political situation in China, their historical background, et cetera, et cetera. So what other ways or what other aspects do you think could be focused on or could be given attention to in terms of understanding these Chinese enterprises other than
for new scholars?
For new scholars, for the emerging scholars.
So actually, what I would say is, if you're a new scholar and you're not Chinese, you might have missed the boat a bit, okay? Because entering the Chinese, market of research, I think you are at a huge disadvantage if you're not Chinese because of language. So, I actually made a very large investment of time in learning the language. So the language piece is a fundamental issue. And access, of course, is another fundamental issue, the contacts. So either if you're a new researcher, the only way for you to get in if you don't speak Chinese is if you have some Chinese scholar partners who have access and language that can do it for you, right? But then again, what is your advantage? Where is your comparative advantage? So in fact, I was just talking to, I just saw this dissertation development proposal for Indonesia. And I thought, wow, that's really great. So I wouldn't recommend people to study China now, unless you're Chinese, because you're already 20 years behind. So you have to do 20 years of catch up just to know where we are. And then you're at a comparative disadvantage because you don't have the language and the contacts. And in fact, I would tell you, go study Vietnam, go study Indonesia, go study the Philippines. The Philippines is one of the biggest exporters of people, for example. Here is a new way of thinking of globalization, right? Philippines is a case in point, as you know, that is very unique from the rest of the country. Indonesia, I was just talking, I was watching this dissertation proposal where they're talking about, for example, Indonesia and Malaysia, you have the impact of religion, that is quite different, right? So certain industries are excluded to some extent or restricted to another extent, like alcohol. Other industries can thrive, like halal foods, and yet other industries will develop differently altogether because of the same kind of factors. I don't know, the regime type or the industrial structure or government involvement in the economy. So I would argue, and I know this talks about China, but I would argue, look, I'm the editor in chief of the International Journal of Emerging Markets. So I have a panoramic view of emerging markets, and my sense is go after those markets that haven't been overly researched. Some of them are old countries that we knew a lot about, but we since we didn't research them, we kind of missed it. Russia, good case in point, right? Like, why don't we study Russians and Russian enterprises? They were important during the Soviet era and during the Cold War, and we were studying them. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, we lost interest in Russia. But come on, it's a huge country. It's an important country. It's a geopolitical force. It's a country that makes an impact on the rest of the world. So that would be my conclusion and my suggestion to young scholars: find the areas where not a lot of people have done work and become known in those areas. In fact, that was my dissertation advisor advice to me when I was looking for a topic. He said to me, find an area where a lot of people are now researching. There you can be an expert. You can be the world expert. And it took me a while. I found something. And for my case, it was international franchising, which the field of IB was underdeveloped. And I became kind of the IF, international franchising, one of the world experts, probably the top 5 if you look at Google Scholar. So the point is, in China, I got into it 20 years ago, as you mentioned. So yeah, 20 years ago, China, not a lot of people were interested in China. In fact, no one even now, when I remember telling people China, they're like, oh, you're China crazy. Now everybody's talking about China. And I'm like, okay, move on. Let's go to Indonesia. Let's go to Vietnam. So try to be one step ahead of everybody else.
All right. I think we have covered a lot today, which is fantastic. Do you have any final thoughts and insights that you would like to share, particularly those who perhaps are already doing research on China, or those who are starting to think of doing? I know that you mentioned some of them, but any other final thoughts that you'd like to share?
First, about the theory. I think that there's 2 approaches. Number one, let's use the existing theories, see if they work. And maybe on the opposite side, the assumptions are different. Let's create new theories. And in the middle somewhere, there is, let's see if we can use the old theories, relax some of the assumptions, adapt these old theories, and try to kind of, systematically change them so they are more inclusive, more generalizable. So I think as a researcher, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is kind of my paradigm, right? Am I working within the old paradigm? Am I working in a completely kind of indigenous paradigm, a new paradigm, trying to explain this phenomenon? China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, whichever, right? Or am I in the middle? I'm trying to just kind of adapt, add another variable, to the old theories where it includes kind of the new component that I'm looking at, right? So first question you have to ask yourself is, what is my paradigm? And then the second question you have to ask yourself, what is the data? So I just as an example, if you look at the Chinese OFDI data, it turns out, and Dylan Sutherland and John Anderson have done some work on this, that most of the research on Chinese OFDI is garbage in, garbage out. The reason being is that the data is fundamentally flawed. Chinese OFDI data, for example, doesn't includes a lot of times tax havens. So if you take it out, you have if you take out Hong Kong and the British Virgin Islands, a few others, then you really have a very, very biased data set. And if you keep it in, then you have also, because a lot of this money goes to the British Virgin Islands and then move on to other places or round trips, as I mentioned earlier, right? So you run these regressions, you get some results, and it's basically worthless. So the 2 fundamental issues for emerging markets researchers, China included, is A, where am I going to get reliable data? B, what is my theoretical paradigm in which I want to work in? And I think individually, each one of us, going back to our earlier conversation, need to think about what is my comparative advantage? What do I have that fellow researchers sitting in other offices in my university and other universities don't have? Is it the language? Is it the contacts? Is it the industry that I have specific knowledge on? What is it that I'm bringing? What is my value added as a researcher? And that's something that I think we need to teach our PhD students as well.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Ilan, for sharing your wealth of knowledge about China and other emerging markets. Thank you for a great conversation. Unfortunately, our time is limited, so let us all thank Professor Alon for sharing his time and expertise with us.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of I Am Global. If you like this episode, please like the track and share it in social media. Stay safe.